Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is the Ukraine War Frontline update for the 8th of May 2023. Before we go to the Frontline, let's see what the ISW has to say in their preamble, and it's all about Prigozhin and the fact that his threatening of the Russian MOD with pulling out of Bakhmut if he doesn't get ammunition and giving his positions over to the Akhmat, the Chechen fighters under Ramzan Kadyrov, has been successful in getting basically the Russian MOD and the Kremlin to capitulate. So Wagner Group financier Prigozhin and Chechen leader Kadyrov may have compelled the Russian theater commander in Ukraine, Gerasimov, to resume artillery ammunition distribution to the Wagner forces in Bakhmut, despite Gerasimov's desired deprioritization of that effort. Kadyrov's threats to transfer his forces to Bakhmut may have blackmailed the Russian military command into allocating ammunition to Wagner mercenaries. Loads of analysis there, lots more to say, but the general conclusion for me is these events raise questions about Russia's ability to coordinate a coherent theatre-wide defensive campaign. All this kind of infighting is just not going to help. Prigozhin and Kadyrov's ability to significantly influence the Russian military command decisions relies on Putin's willingness to appease them and his reliance on their forces, both of which will likely degrade after further blackmail efforts. So that kind of infighting still continues, and it's still a major element of what is going on in Bakhmut. Right, let's go to the northeast sector, which is Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna front line. On the war map, a map looks like this down. That's the axis there. We're going to actually go to the top here. There's Kupiansk and then Svatova down there. We're going to look at Vilshana because there's been some move in Vilshana. There's been some territory exchanged. It doesn't really say too much in the ISW, to be perfectly honest. It just talks about the usual unsuccessful attacks, but it does mention unsuccessful Russian operations in Sinkivka, which is in that area. And then the Russians say, that's from the Ukrainian general staff, the Russians say that the MOD has suppressed 4 Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups near Kislivka, somewhere further down south, and Sinkivka. So there is activity, both sides claiming activity in Sinkivka. Sinkivka is there. So there's this line, if you remember, I don't even remember, the line went across there, and now there is some Ukrainian gained territory. If we go to Poulet-Volon's map, there is, as you can see, claimed territory gain into the grey zone for the Ukrainians, not really affecting the Russian territory. That stays where it is, according to him. I have slightly, I mean, it all amounts to the same. This is what Syriac Maps pro-Russian mapper says the Ukrainian army advanced south of Vilshana from 3 axes, reaching the outskirts of the town. That is the town of Vilshana, which is this long town that goes along there to Persha-Travnevi, which is further to the east. And that is, that's what's happening there. There is some activity. Keep an eye on that. Nothing's particularly happened there for a long time. The activity's been further to the west in Dvorichna area, Liman Pashi to some extent, Tavilzhanka. So that's something to keep an eye on. Other than that, as I say, it's all the usual places are mentioned, or some of the usual places. I think is actually somewhat quieter. Not as many places mentioned. Novoselivska, activity there. And actually, if we go to Tatarigami, so the next port of call, I guess, on the way down. So really nothing to say about this whole front until we get to Bilahorivka is mentioned in the ISW. Actually, didn't even mention Tierney and Torska and those places. But Spirna is mentioned by Tatarigami. Now, there's been talk about Spirna a little bit over the last few days, not really anything significant, just in the general staff reports and whatnot. But Tatarigami says for 3 consecutive days, the enemy attempted to assault Spirna, but each time they suffered losses and were forced to retreat. In the latest attack, the enemy, that being the Russians, lost 1 BMP and BTR, so infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carrier, and their T-90 tanks, so one of the better tanks, was damaged before they once again retreated. So activity has been taking place there. And then we're going to go to... my good old mouse is just not working. We're going to go down to Bakhmut already. So as we come down to Bakhmut, there is, before we get into the center, there was talk about this area in a very small uh, village called Sako Ivanseti, where the Ukrainians made some gains there in terms of taking some trenches. Indeed, the ISW does make mention of that, saying Russian forces made some territorial gains in Bakhmut as of May the 7th. Geolocated footage indicates that Wagner group forces advanced further west in Bakhmut and near Sako Ivanseti. So that is the Wagner forces moving in Sako Ivanseti rather than the Ukrainian forces, and they give this footage here. Now, this is quite, I say, famous footage. This footage did the rounds of Ukrainians taking uh, this trench system, taking out these 3 Russians there, and it was all. Yeah, I won't show you that. It's a little bit inappropriate, but that one did do the rounds. Lots of people were saying we're talking about that bit of footage. If we see where that is here. So that's in the grey zone, and I would actually kind of disagree with ISW. I'd say that that's the Ukrainians taking that trench, and that doesn't show that the Russians have, that Wagner have made advances there. If that is indeed the footage they're referring to, and it is, but the other footage they are referring to is as follows. But I'm fairly sure this is a footage that I showed evidence of yesterday. So a little bit dubious as to what is going on there. I'm going to paste that in and see where that is, and showing that Wagner have advanced. Yep, that's exactly what I talked about yesterday. So I don't think that's showing any advances from any evidence of advances from yesterday, as according to the ISW. However, if we look at other sources, there certainly appears to be some small advances in this northern area. Well, let's go to the war mapper first. And sometimes I think the war mapper are just a little bit behind. Russians have continued to advance in the north towards the remaining stronghold of the high density residential area in the west. I actually think that's a lot of what we'd already had previously. Poulet-Vallon's general map of the area shows that the Russians are pressuring pretty much everywhere, but inside Bakhmut, it is in this eastern area, the front along the main road, cutting through the remaining area. We have here no reports saying to the front there's heavy fighting in Bakhmut. Wagner has increased the pressure with renewed attacks on the 0506 at Kremove, so that's in the northern area. So far, the AFU is holding out there, while in the western part, the fighting takes place just west of Tchaikovsky Street, near Redeemers of Donbass Square. So the fighting is going on. Well, it's going on all along the front, really. Syriac maps suggest that there's some small amount of ground that has been taken in the north. So in this area, a little bit more ground. I haven't actually adapted that on my map, but it really is just a sliver of ground here. Deep State map, the pro-Ukrainian map, is being very quiet on the mapping front. I don't know whether they are under operational security at the moment. So there are claims about activity happening elsewhere, and there's no changing in the mapping. A little bit of a change here, and I don't know if that's rejigging or whether it signifies that they think the Russians actually gained territory yesterday, because it's still within the Syriac maps bounds. So the Syriac maps pro-Russian mapper has the Russians up to here, and Deep State map added just literally this kind of little bit of a sliver there of territory. So not really too much in terms of huge amounts of ground being taken by the Russians, but the Russians are still pressuring there. The Wagner are still working hard there. Rebar, the pro-Ukrainian source, says in Bakhmut, the Wagner PMC assault groups are storming the last Ukrainian positions in the western quarters of the city. On the northern flank, Russian units managed to break through the enemy's defenses along Peremogi and Tolbahina streets. To the south, fierce fighting is going on for the so-called Nest, a complex of multi-story buildings turned into a powerful fortified area by the AFU. The Wagner PMC assault groups are methodically moving in the direction of the Peremoha cinema westward of Tchaikovsky Street. So that is basically to say it's all about this area here, this sort of main street there. Still this outpost of Ukrainian forces to the east of that main road coming up through. It's a T0504 highway coming through Ivanivska. If we look at what ISW continues to say, Wagner-affiliated mill blogger claimed that Wagner artillery has increased its rate of fire in the Bakhmut area following the May the 7th artillery ammunition delivery from the Russian MOD. Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces spokesperson Cherevati stated yesterday that Wagner units, not Chechen units, are continuing to attack in Bakhmut, and noted that Russian artillery fire did not decrease in the city despite the claims of shell hunger in the area. Ukrainian Eastern Group of Forces commander Syritsky stated yesterday that Russian forces increased the rate of shelling on the Bakhmut area and that Russian forces still hope to capture the city by May the 9th. They have not got long left to do that, but then again, there isn't all that much territory still to gain. There are seems that Kadyrov is sending at least some Akhmat fighters to support Prigozhin's mercenaries in Bakhmut, but it could be, as it says here, just a symbolic support. That seems to have forced the Russians, the Russian MOD, to have given ammunition supplies to the Wagner again, and then lots of propaganda about the situation in Bakhmut. Objective data based on about the past 24 hours of NASA FIRMS data. So just to remind you what FIRMS data is, was originally designed to find heat signatures around the planet to work out where wildfires are in order to stop wildfires, but it's been able to be co-opted in this conflict to work out where there is activity, fires burning or artillery taking place, firing or rockets landing, whatever. Lots of propaganda has made us possibly think that the Ukrainians are under super amounts of pressure. They are, but it doesn't. It also, it can also be true that the Russians are under pressure behind their lines as well, as according to this firm's data here, which shows more fires in a Russian-held territory than in Ukrainian-held territory. So much further back behind the lines, the Ukrainians are obviously hammering Russian ammunition depots. I would think that's what that means. I say obviously. I would suppose that is what is happening. They're hitting behind the Russian immediate lines and taking out artillery ammunition depots and whatnot. That is essentially Bakhmut in a nutshell. Kenneth Gregg, the Swedish fighter in Ukraine with his contacts there, says the biggest news in the last 24 hours is probably the loss of prestige for the Wagner boss Prigozhin. Kadyrov switched sides and told him to stay behind and bleed to death. This is how Greg interprets it. He sent his troops again to storm our positions. A huge amount of phosphorus bombs have been used in the last 2 days. In using them, the enemy cannot send in their foot soldiers, as the phosphorus and the small fires are not harmless to them either. There's arguments as to whether incendiary is different from phosphorus, and they're actually using the argument is whether they're using other incendiary ammunition. On the frontline reporting up north near Vilshana, he says the Russians have shelled our positions south of Vilshana, showing that our troops have advanced within 2 lines of trees towards the village. On the Tversky front, our troops attacked Russian trenches near Saka Ivanseti, and the settlement partially recovered previously lost trenches. And in Bakhmut city, the enemy advanced a few houses westward towards the last high-rise area under our control. Our troops blew up a housing block to slow down the advancing Wagner mercenaries south of the 54th base. It's now likely that the 54th has left the base. And it goes on to talk about Adivka, and we'll come to that in a second. It's quite, I think, significant. So that is what is taking place in Bakhmut. Again, there's not a lot of ground left there. The question is whether the Ukrainians will launch some kind of counterattack in that area to stop the Russians from having any success on Victory Day. There really isn't long left for the Ukrainians to do something if they want to do some surprise attack before or on the 9th. And there really isn't a lot of time for the Russians to fully take the rest of Bakhmut. They would have to do some significant work to take the rest of Bakhmut indeed. And it does seem unlikely, even though there is relatively very little territory still to take. So Bakhmut, moving on from there to Avdiivka, and we come down to further south past New York, indeed, where there's been activity, but still unsure of exactly what has happened, territorially speaking. And again, I don't know whether this is as a result of a bit of operational security amongst some sources. If we come to the ISW, they talk of Adivka in the normal way, which is repelled attacks in Avdiivka, Pervomaisky, and that's pretty much it. Then goes on to mention Marinka, Russian mill blogger claiming that Russian forces failed to advance and the sudden approaches to Avdiivka and in Marinka. So a failure uh, to make any gains there for the Russians. Um, I just go back to Kenneth Gregg, who said there was some talk the other day about failed attack in Avdiivka that cost the Russians dearly. He says, and again, can't verify this, take it with a pinch of salt, but he says Avdiivka, the Russians lost 400 men in a senseless attack. Right now, it looks like we are mastering the situation in the area. So that is significant if that has happened, but again, I cannot verify that. But that is really all the information I have on this area. It looks like there's no mapping changes from either side. Just Pervomaisky there is the only place that's really mentioned. Not even hearing anything about Krasnohorivka, Novokononyove, Novobakhmutivka, all these kind of areas that there has been a lot of activity around. And we come to Marinka, that the claim there is Russian mill blogger claiming that the Russians themselves have failed to make any advances in the south. And then we come down really from there to Vuhledar. Again, not much information coming out here. Kenneth Gregg does mention it in that the latest report from Taraz is that the situation is stable and we now have good drone surveillance of the Russians and their activities, but their artillery managed to hit one of our artillery pieces. And he goes on to talk about the offense, our offense. The last troop movements are happening right now, and we are waiting for marching orders. So that is to indicate that the counteroffensive could happen very soon indeed, or it may not. It may not happen till within June. I just don't know. So let's go and see what the ISW has to say about the rest of the front. So no confirmed or claimed ground attacks in Western Donetsk. Moving on to, I think it might just be in Zaporizhia. I'll have a look. Velika Novosilka. The Russians claimed that they repelled a Ukrainian reconnaissance in force operation near there and a sabotage group. Reconnaissance group near Levadne in Zaporizhia. So actually, Velika Novosilka is in Donetsk still, but it is somewhat to the west here. There it is, Velika Novosilka. So a repelled attack there, and then you've got the border just to the west of that. And then Levadna, which is just here, a reconnaissance repelled reconnaissance attack there, or reconnaissance activity there. So I wonder whether the Ukrainians are just consistently probing all up and down here. There's probably a lot more activity than is being reported, but I can't confirm that. That's just me having a wild guess. And other than that, not much to report. I mean, there's a little bit to say here. The Russian MOD acknowledged that Ukrainian forces maintain a presence on the islands in the Dnipro River Delta. As of yesterday, the Russian MOD claimed on yesterday that Russian forces struck a Ukrainian command center on Veliki Potemkin Island. And other than that, it's just the usual kind of swapping of artillery and a lot of drone activity. As it talks about here in the Crimea area. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces launched up to 23 drones, and as I reported this morning, the Russians claim that they shot down all of those drones. So there is definitely shaping activities taking place, probably all around Zaporizhia, Kherson Oblast, and in Crimea as well. But other than that, not a pretty quiet day, all things considered. It's really all about Bakhmut, as it always seems to be, but primarily because there's only one day left for Victory Day. And if the Russians really want to use that as a symbolic Victory Day, they've got to get their troops moving, and they've got to get a lot more success than they have had over the last few weeks, a lot quicker. And the Ukrainians will have something to say about that. The question, as I've said, is will the Ukrainians launch something today or perhaps tomorrow? Or is that just psyops? And they just bleed the Russians as much as possible and hold on to Bakhmut while they get things going elsewhere for their larger counteroffensive. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you later.